Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 20, A New Lodger. The long vacation saunters on toward term time. Like an idle river very leisurely strolling down a flat country to the sea, Mr. Guppy saunters along it congenially. He has blunted the blade of his penknife and broken the point off by sticking that instrument into his desk in every direction. Not that he bears the desk any ill will, but he must do something, and it must be something of an exciting nature, which will lay neither his physical nor his intellectual energies under too heavy contribution. He finds that nothing agrees with him so well as to make little gyrations on one leg of his stool and stab his desk and gape. Kenge and Carboy are out of town, and the articled clerk has taken out a shooting license and gone down to his father's, and Mr. Guppy's two fellow stipendiaries are away on leave. Mr. Guppy and Mr. Richard Carstone divide the dignity of the office, but Mr. Carstone is for the time being established in Kenge's room, whereat Mr. Guppy chafes so exceedingly that he, with biting sarcasm, informs his mother in the confidential moments when he sups with her in the old street road that he is afraid the office is hardly good enough for swells, and that if he had known there was a swell coming, he would have got it painted. Mr. Guppy suspects everybody who enters on the occupation of a stool in Kenge and Carboy's office of entertaining, as a matter of course, sinister designs upon him. He is clear that every such person wants to depose him on the strength of these profound views. He, in the most ingenious manner, takes infinite pains to counterplot when there is no plot, and plays the deeper games of chess without any adversary. It is a source of much gratification to Mr. Guppy, therefore, to find the newcomer constantly poring over the papers in jaundice, for he well knows that nothing but confusion and failure can come from that. His satisfaction communicates itself to a third saunterer through the long vacation in Kenge and Carboy's office, to wit, young Smallweed, whether young Smallweed, metaphorically called small, and eke chickweed, as it were jocularly to express to a fledgling, was ever a boy, is much doubted in Lincoln's Inn. He is now something under 15, and an old limb of the law. He is a town-made article of small stature and weazened features, but may be perceived from a considerable distance by means of his tall hat. Mr. Guppy has been lolling out the window all the morning, while thus looking out into the shade of Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, surveying the intolerable bricks and the mortar. Mr. Guppy becomes conscious of a manly whisker emerging from the cloistered walk below, and turning itself up in the direction of his face. At the same time, a low whistle is wafted through the inn, and a suppressed voice crawls, "Hip, Guppy!" "Why, you don't mean it," says Mr. Guppy, aroused. "Small, he is jobbling. Where have you sprung from?" "From the market gardens down by Deptford. I can't stand it any longer. I must enlist, I say. Just throw out half a crown if you've got one to spare. I want to get some dinner." "Will you come and dine with me?" says Mr. Guppy, throwing out the coin, which Mr. Jobling catches neatly. "How long should I have to hold out?" says Jobling. "Not half an hour," returns Mr. Guppy. "Can you give a fellow anything to read in the meantime?" says Mr. Jobling. "You shall have the paper," says Mr. Guppy, "but you had better not be seen about here. Sit in our staircase and read. It's a quieter place." Jobling nods intelligence and acquiescence. The sagacious Smallweed supplies him with the newspaper, and at last fetches Mr. Jobling up. "Well, and how are you?" says Mr. Guppy, shaking hands with him. So, how are you?" During this short colloquy, the active Smallweed, who is of the dinner party, has written in legal characters on a slip of paper, "Return immediately." They betake themselves to a neighboring dining house of the class known among its frequenters by the denomination Slap Bang. Into the dining house Mr. Smallweed leads the way. They know him there, and defer to him. Mr. Guppy consults him in the choice of that day's banquet, saying, "What do you take, Chick?" Chick is out of the profundity of his artfulness. preferring veal and ham and French beans. And don't you forget the stuffing, Polly. Mr. Guppy and Mr. Jobling give the like order. 3 pint pots and a half and half are superadded. Mr. Jobling is buttoned up closer than mere adornment might require. He has the faded appearance of a gentleman in embarrassed circumstances. Even his light whiskers droop with something of a shabby air. His appetite is so vigorous that it suggests spare living for some time back. "Now, Small," says Guppy, "what would you recommend about pastry?" "Marrow puddings," says Smallweed insistently. "Aye, aye," cries Mr. Jobling with an arch look. "You're there, are you? Thank you, Mr. Guppy. I don't know but what I will take a marrow pudding." 3 marrow puddings produced. To these succeeded, by command of Mr. Smallweed, 3 Cheshires, and to these 3 small rums. "What do you think now?" says Mr. Guppy, about enlisting. "Why, I may think after dinner," returns Mr. Jobling. What I may think after dinner," returns Mr. Jobling, "is one thing, my dear Guppy, and what I may think before dinner is another thing. Still, even after dinner, I ask myself the question, how am I to live? Il faut manger, you know," says Mr. Jobling, pronouncing that word as if he meant a necessary fixture in an English stable. "Il faut manger, that's the French saying, and mangering is as necessary to me as it is to a Frenchman, or more so, if any man had told me," pursues Jobling, "even so lately as when you and I had the frisk down in Lincolnshire, Guppy, and drove over to see that house at Chesney Wold, that I should be as hard up at the present time as I literally find myself, I should have pitched into him," says Mr. Jobling. "Still, Tony, you were on the wrong side of the post then," remonstrates Mr. Guppy. "You were talking about nothing else in the gig." "Guppy," says Mr. Jobling, "I will not deny it. I was on the wrong side of the post, but I trusted to things coming round." That very popular trust in flat things coming round. Not in their being beaten round or worked round, but in their coming round, as though a lunatic should trust in the world's coming triangular. "I had confident expectations that things would come round and be all square," says Mr. Jobling, with some vagueness of expression, and perhaps of meaning too. "But I was disappointed they never did, and when it came to creditors making rows at the office, and to people that the office dealt with making complaints about dirty trifles of borrowed money, why, there was an end of that connection, and of any new professional connection too, for I was to give a reference tomorrow. For if I was to give a reference tomorrow, it would be mentioned, and would sew me up. Then what's a fellow to do? I have been keeping out of the way, and living cheaply, down about the market gardens. But what's the use of living cheap, when you have got no money? You might as well live dear. It's the fashionable way, and fashion and whiskers have been my weaknesses. I don't care who knows it," says Mr. Jobling. "They are great weaknesses, Dame Sir. They are great. Well," proceeds Mr. Jobling, "what could a fellow do, I ask you, but enlist?" "Jobling," says Mr. Guppy, "myself and our mutual friend Smallweed have had a little conversation on this matter more than once since you left the inn, and I have mentioned to our mutual friend Smallweed a plan I have lately thought of proposing. You know Snagsby, the stationer?" "I know there is such a stationer," returns Mr. Jobling. "He is not ours, and I am not acquainted with him." "He is ours, Jobling, and I am acquainted with him," Mr. Guppy retorts. "Well, sir, I have lately become better acquainted with him, through some accidental circumstances that have made me a visitor of his in private life. Both Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby are very willing to oblige me, and Snagsby has, in busy times, a good deal of copying work to give out. Now, gentlemen of the jury," says Mr. Guppy, now, Jobling, you may say this is a poor prospect of a living, granted, but it's better than nothing, and better than enlistment. You want time? There must be time for these late affairs to blow over. You might live through it on much worse terms than by writing for Snagsby. There are two branches on this subject, Jobling. There is the first, I come to the second. You know Crook, the Chancellor, across the lane. Come, Jobling, says Mr. Guppy. I think you know Crook, the Chancellor, across the lane. I know him by sight, says Mr. Jobling. You know him by sight, very well. And you know Little Flight? Everybody knows her, said Mr. Jobling. Very well. Now, it has been one of my duties of late to pay Flight a certain weekly allowance, deducting it from the amount of her weekly rent, which I have paid in consequence of instructions I have received, to Crook himself in her presence. This has brought me into communication with Crook, and into a knowledge of his house and his habits. I know he has a room to let. You may live there at a very low charge under any name you like. He'll ask no questions and would accept you as a tenant at a word from me. And I tell you another thing, Jobling, says Mr. Guppy, who has suddenly lowered his voice and become familiar again. He is an extraordinary old chap, always rummaging among a litter of papers and grubbing away at teaching himself to read and write, without getting on a bit, it seems to me. He is a most extraordinary old chap, sir. I don't know but what it might be worth a fellow's while to look him up a bit. You don't mean, Mr. Jobling began. I mean, returned Mr. Guppy, shrugging his shoulders with becoming modesty, that I can't make him out. I have seen something of the profession and something of the life, Tony, and it's seldom I can make a man out I can't make a man out more or less. But such an old card as this, so deep, so sly, and secret, though I don't believe he is ever sober, I never came across. Now, he must be precious old, you know, and he has not a soul about him, and he is reported to be immensely rich. It might pay you to knock up a sort of knowledge of him. I don't see why you shouldn't go in for it when everything else suits. Mr. Jobling, Mr. Guppy, and Mr. Smallweed all lean their elbows on the table and their chins upon their hands and look at the ceiling. After a time, they all drink, slowly lean back, put their hands in their pockets, and look at one another. If I had the energy I once possessed, Tony, says Mr. Guppy with a sigh. Mr. Guppy concludes by resigning the adventure to Tony Jobling and informing him that during the vacation, and while things are slack, his purse, as far as 3 or 4, even 5 pounds goes, will be at his disposal. For never shall it be said, Mr. Guppy adds with emphasis, that William Guppy turned his back upon his friend. Crook's last lodger died there, observes Mr. Guppy in an incidental way. Did he, though? Says Mr. Jobling. There was a verdict. Accidental death. You don't mind that? No, says Mr. Jobling. I don't mind it, but he might as well have died somewhere else. It's devilish odd that he need to go and die at my place. Mr. Jobling quite resents this liberty. There are places enough to die in, I should think. However, the compact being virtually made, Mr. Guppy proposes to dispatch the trusty Smallweed to ascertain if Mr. Crook is at home. As is the case, they would complete the negotiation without delay. Mr. Jobling approving, Smallweed puts himself under the tall hat and conveys it out of the dining room in the Guppy Manor. He soon returns with the intelligence that Mr. Crook is at home, and that he has seen him through the shop door, sitting in the back premises, sleeping, like 1 o'clock. Then I'll pay, says Mr. Guppy, and we'll go and see him. Mr. Guppy and Mr. Jobling repair to the rag and bottle shop, where they find Crook still sleeping like 1 o'clock, that is to say, breathing strenuously with his chin upon his breast, and quite insensible to any external sounds, or even to gentle shaking. On the table beside him, among the usual lumber, stand an empty gin bottle and a glass. The unwholesome air is so stained with his liquor that even the green eyes of the cat upon her shelf, as they open and shut, glimmer on the visitors look drunk. "Hold up here," says Mr. Guppy, giving the relaxed figure of the old man another shake. "Mr. Crook! Hello, sir! Did you ever see such a stupor as he falls into? Between drink and sleep," says Mr. Guppy. If he has his regular sleep, returns Jobling, rather alarmed, it'll last a long time one of these days, I am thinking. Or if this is his regular sleep, returns Jobling, rather alarmed, it'll last a long time one of these days, I am thinking. It's always more like a fit than a nap, says Mr. Guppy, shaking him again. Halloa, your lordship! Why, he might be robbed 50 times over. Open your eyes! After much ado, he opens them, but without appearing to see his visitors or any other objects. He is alive, at any rate, says Mr. Guppy. How are you, my Lord Chancellor? I have brought a friend of mine, sir, on a little matter of business. The old man makes an attempt to rise. They help him up, and he staggers against the wall and stares at them. How do you do, Mr. Crook? Says Mr. Guppy in some discomfiture. How do you do, sir? I hope you are pretty well. The old man, and aiming a purposeless blow at Mr. Guppy, or at nothing, feebly swings himself round and comes with his face against the wall. So he remains for a minute or two, heaped up against it, and then staggers down the shop to the front door. The air, the movement in the court, the lapse of time, or the combination of these things recovers him. He comes back pretty steadily, adjusting his fur cap on his head and looking keenly at them. Your servant, gentlemen. I have been dozing. Hi, I am hard to wake old times. The man's eyes resting on the empty bottle, he takes it, examines it, and slowly tilts it upside down. I say, he cries, somebody's been making free here. I assure you we found it so, says Mr. Guppy. Would you allow me to get it filled for you? Yes, I certainly would, cries Crook in high glee. Certainly I would. Don't mention it. Get it filled next door. Sole arms. The Lord Chancellor's 14 penny. Bless you, they know me. He presses the empty bottle upon Mr. Guppy. That gentleman, with a nod to his friend, accepts the trust and hurries out, and hurries in again with the bottle filled. The old man receives it in his arms like a beloved grandchild and pats it tenderly. But I say, he whispers with his eyes screwed up after tasting it, this ain't the Lord Chancellor's 14 penny. This is 18 penny. I thought you might like that better, says Mr. Guppy. You're a nobleman, sir, returns Crook with another taste. You're a baron of the land. Taking advantage of this auspicious moment, Mr. Guppy presents his friend under the impromptu name of Mr. Weevil, and states the object of their visit. Crook, with his bottle under his arm, takes time to survey his proposed lodger, and seems to approve of him. You'd like to see the room, young man? He says. Aye, it's a good room. Been whitewashed, been cleaned down with soft soap and soda. Aye, it's worth twice the rent, letting alone my company when you want it. And such a cat to keep the mice away. The old man takes them upstairs, where indeed they do find it cleaner than it used to be, and also containing some old articles of furniture which he has dug up from his inexhaustible stores. The terms are easily concluded, for the Lord Chancellor cannot be hard on Mr. Guppy, associated as he is with Kenyon Carboy, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and other famous claims on his professional consideration, and it is agreed that Mr. Weevil shall take possession on the morrow. Mr. Weevil and Mr. Guppy then repair to Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, where the personal introduction of the former Mr. Snagsby is effected, and, more important, the vote and interest of Mrs. Snagsby are secured. On the morrow, in the dusk of evening, Mr. Weevil modestly appears at Crook's, by no means incommoded with luggage, and establishes himself in his new lodgings, where the two eyes in the shutters stare at him in his sleep, as if they were full of wonder. On the following day, Mr. Weevil, who is a handy, good-for-nothing kind of young fellow, borrows a needle and thread off Miss Flight and a hammer of his landlord, and goes to work devising apologies for the window curtains, and knocking up apologies for the shelves, and hanging up his crockery and sundries on a pennyworth of little hooks, like a shipwrecked sailor making the best of it. But what Mr. Weevil prizes most of all his few possessions is a choice collection of copperplate impressions from that truly national work, the Divinities of Albion, or Galaxy Gallery of British Beauty, representing ladies of title and fashion in every variety of smirk that art combined with capital is capable of producing. With these magnificent portraits, Unworthy confined in a bandbox during his seclusion among the market gardens, he declares his apartment and the result is very imposing. He is a quiet lodger, full of handy shifts and devices, as before mentioned, able to cook and clean for himself as well as to carpenter, and developing social inclinations after the shades of evening have fallen on the court. At those times when he is not visited by Mr. Guppy, he comes out of his dull room and talks to Crook, or is very free, as they call it in the court, commendingly with anyone disposed for conversation. And that is the end of chapter 20.